I love all the adventure and thinking that's required while you read this book. Okay, that's it, said Mr. Garvey. That's all we get. There was a clue in the computer, said Winston. Wasn't there? Oh, yeah, said Mel. What does it say? Jake pressed more buttons. Then he groaned. Oh, no, that's the clue? What? What is it? Jake peeked over at Winston's shoulder, saw the screen, and smacked himself in the forehead. The clue to the sixth puzzle was the same sign they'd seen all day long. The guy with shiny teeth holding up a bag of square potato chips. Think square, the man was eternally saying. That's all we get, Mel said. Think square? What does that mean? Silence descended on the team. Winston didn't know how to think square, and nobody else had ideas either. Mr. Garvey's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, and handed it to Winston. It's for you. For me? And then he realized, or remembered Ray Marietta. Could the ex-cop really have figured something out? He took the phone from his teacher. Ray? He said. All right, Ray said brusquely. I had someone look into your little problem. Really? Who? I do a little private detective work once in a while. It brought me in touch with some colorful characters. I know a guy. He knows everything there is to know about the phone system. If anyone on earth could get the number from somebody who called you, he's the guy. You hired a computer hacker? Winston was astounded. There was a small silence, and then Ray said, Well, that would be illegal, so no, I'm not going to say he's a hacker. He's more like a magician, a telephone magician. Okay, said Winston, but he thought, yeah, he's a hacker. Winston was amused and a little amazed at the idea of Ray Marietta, big and no nonsense, calling up a computer hacker on his behalf. What did this magician say? Winston asked. I gave him a brief rundown on everything you told me, gave him your phone number, and he just called me back. He was able to get a list of people who called your house that day. You say this guy, the cheater, called you in the afternoon, somewhere around 4 o'clock? Mm-hmm. Winston held his breath. Was he really about to learn the identity of the cheater? You got one phone call at that time. It came from a residence in West Meadow, someone with a last name of Root. Do you know anyone with that last name? Could the cheater be Brendan Root? Chapter 12. Winston had hoped Ray Marietta could help them out, providing answers to a few mysterious questions. Now, hanging up the phone, he found that the questions had only multiplied. Jake and Mel were staring at him. What did he say? Jake asked. Brendan Root called me, he said. He looked up at his friends. That mysterious phone call a few days back? It was Brendan Root. That kid? Said Mel, and they all looked over to where Brendan was pacing. Winston could not wrap his head around it. But he can't be the cheater, and he can't be working with the cheater. That makes no sense. Why not? Said Mr. Garvey. They haven't been hit by the cheater. Isn't that what you told me? No flat tires? No sabotage of any kind. Now, isn't that suspicious? The man in the green jacket is working with one of these teams, so why not them? But, Winston said, wondering what he was going to say next. And your name was in the cheater's papers, Mr. Garvey reminded him. How did the cheater know you would be here? He pointed again at Brendan. That young man called you and asked you directly. Winston stared at the trees in the sky. Mr. Garvey was right. It had to be. Winston called him, hoping to find out if Winston would be at the puzzle event. Told the answer was yes. Brendan had spread the news. He told the man in the green jacket who put Winston on the list of kids to watch out for. How else would Winston's name have found his name onto the cheaters list? But it still felt wrong somehow. Winston thought back to the conversations he'd had with Brendan. That first meeting in the potato chip factory. Brendan seemed thrilled to meet Winston and acted like someone who couldn't wait to start a one-on-one do-or-die puzzle competition. Brendan didn't have to come over to introduce himself at all, but he did. And then in the parking lot of the amusement park, Brendan wanted to cheat, helping Winston. Brendan would have given Winston the answer to the Ferris wheel puzzle if Winston had agreed. He was sure of it. So what do you want to do? Mal said. Walk over there and accuse him? Of course not, Mr. Garvey said airily. Don't be silly. They haven't won yet, and if they do, then we'll discuss how to make sense of this interesting new information. Mr. Garvey smiled for maybe the first time all day. He looked as satisfied as a cat with a new toy. Then he continued, Until then, we have a puzzle to solve, don't we? We should get back to that. And he shook the list of words as emphasis. Yes, true. They still needed to solve the sixth puzzle. Winston tried to distance himself from thoughts of Brendan Root, and it wasn't easy. It was too incredible. The idea of Brendan tracking him down and calling, and it was even more incredible to imagine Brendan passing that information on to that crazy, dangerous man who fought with Jake. Why had Winston said yes to the mysterious caller's questions? Why did Winston tell a total stranger, one trying to disguise his voice, that he planned to be at the puzzle contest? He should have just hung up, and then Winston's name would not have been on that list, and then maybe they would have won the whole thing by now. Winston, said Mr. Garvey. Winston looked up at his teacher, who shook the list of words again. Right, the puzzle. They still had work to do. Reluctantly, Winston stood up and looked again at the 5 answers. Quasar, Thresh, Icarus, Acquit, Unsure. Let's hear some suggestions, Mr. Garvey said. Mal said slowly, Maybe these words are all clues. To what? The 6th word. Winston looked at the list. You're saying Quasar, Thresh, Icarus are all clues to the same answer? Now what answer could that be? I don't know. Some word I've never heard of would be my guess. Is there a mythical farmer who lives in outer space? No, of course not. There was a dead end, so they all tried to think of new ideas. They paced, stared at the words, waiting and hoping for something to jump out. There are 2 Q's, said Jake after a while. So, Mr. Garvey said. There are 2 H's, Jake continued. 2 C's, 2 I's. Isn't that strange? There are 2 of just about everything. Well, there are 4 U's, Mal said, and 4 A's. Jake counted and saw Mal was right. That's still an even number. But what does it mean? Mal asked. Jake didn't know. He shook his head and went back to staring at the words. They became silent. Winston looked back over to Brendan Root, still pacing over there on the other side of the green. His team had a pretty big jump on the 6th puzzle, but so far they hadn't gotten anywhere. A momentary spark of hope Winston had felt was dying out. How could they catch up when Brendan and his team had been thinking about this for so much longer? Jake was poking at the computer again. 5 teams have solved everything but the final puzzle. It's anybody's game to win. There was shouting to their right. They looked over to see the Lincoln kids on the next bench down, maybe 20 yards away. They were jumping around and slapping each other happily. Mal said, Well, that makes 6 teams that have solved everything but the final puzzle. Mr. Garvey stood up as if to make a pronouncement. He was pretending to ignore Lincoln, but Winston could see he was fueled with new urgency. These are all 6-letter words. Do you think the final answer is going to have 6 letters too? Winston asked. Think it's likely, the math teacher said. There's the library. Let's go get a dictionary and plug a 6-letter word into the computer one at a time. Brilliant, Mal, Jake said. We'll have the right answer in 50 to 100 years. Oh, that's better than never. The first word is probably He pronounced this by emitting a weird and strangled yell. Jake and Winston laughed. I don't think that's a word. Sure it is, along with yarg and blah and all those comic book screams. Mr. Garvey was standing over Mal, glaring down. If you can't take this seriously, go wait in the car. Mal shrank as if Mr. Garvey was about to stomp on him. I am taking it seriously, he squeaked. You're making jokes, not even funny ones. If you don't have something useful to add, keep your mouth shut. Slowly, Jake crawled backward a few feet like a wounded crab to get away from Mr. Garvey. But Mr. Garvey wasn't done. He had anger and frustration to spare. You too, Jake. If you don't want to solve this last puzzle, then take Mal back to the car. Jake was nonplussed. What did I say? I didn't do anything. You're not solving the puzzle. You're laughing with your friends and picking at the grass. I'm thinking, Jake yelled back. We're all thinking. I had an idea, but it just didn't work. What do you want from me? The math teacher was now pacing. He was angry beyond reason, his frustration boiling over after a long and hectic day. This is what I mean, Winston. We could have had this last answer. We might have won by now. We might have beaten everybody. If what? Winston said, and then he realized the answer as the question left his mouth. Mr. Garvey seemed to realize he was on the verge of going too far. Indeed, he may have already crossed the line. He didn't answer Winston's question, but sat down, shaking his head. If what? Mal repeated. Nothing, Winston said, looking away. Jake said, No. What is he talking about? Winston looked at his friend. He hated this. What was he supposed to do? So, well, he said reluctantly, Mr. Garvey didn't want you or Mal on the team. He wanted to replace you with kids from his math class. They all looked at Mr. Garvey, who was absorbed in their stares, and finally tossed his arms up. I wanted the best possible team. Is that so wrong? I wanted kids I knew that would take this seriously. We are taking this seriously, Mal said. Well, not seriously enough, Mr. Garvey answered. Winston felt his stomach twist and untwist. He said in a small voice, Mal and Jake have both solved puzzles today. They got the prison right before I did. They're both good at puzzles, Winston persisted. Fine, said Mr. Garvey. He looked stiffly down at Mal and Jake. I apologize for implying otherwise. Jake said to Winston, How did you talk him into keeping us? Jake was a little embarrassed. He twisted a fistful of grass for a moment and admitted, I said I wouldn't do it without you guys. Mal and Jake gaped at each other with real surprise. Then Jake fell backward, laughing at the sky. Aren't you the bestest buddy? Mal said. Quit it, Winston said. It was one thing to stand up for your friends. It was another to be caught doing it. He didn't want to feel like the hero of a bad TV show. They were all quiet for a minute or two. Mr. Garvey seemed to understand that he had forfeited the right to yell at them, at least for a while. Mal and Jake didn't want to rag on Winston any further, and Winston was rolling the 5 words around in his head, looking for the 6th. It looked like every park bench was taken by a team. Winston could still see kids running around, talking to people in the bright shirts. Did those kids know what they were doing yet? Had they figured out the secret behind this puzzle? Or were they just collecting riddles at random for a brilliant idea to strike? Directly across the green, Winston saw Bethany and her friends sitting around. If none of them were chasing down the riddles, that meant they had the answer to this puzzle and were looking for the 6th and final word, just like them. Winston watched his math teacher's head swivel back and forth, watching Brendan Root's team on one hand and Lincoln on the other. Someone was going to get that final word soon. Winston shared Mr. Garvey's sense of helplessness, that it probably wasn't going to be them. None of them had any ideas. Maybe the answer is quaint. Quaint. What? Said Jake. Quaint. Mel squinted and said, Thought you didn't want to try random words. Mr. Garvey turned red and stood up from the bench. Look at the answers. They began with a Q, Tiau. If you add the letter N and scramble them up, you get quaint. Who has the computer? I do, said Jake. Give it to me. Jake stood up. That's not the answer. It doesn't make sense. Mr. Garvey held out his hand. Jake, give me the computer. If I'd suggested that answer, Jake said, you'd make fun of me for being a dumb baseball player, football player, whatever it is I play. Winston and Mal shared a panicked glance. Mr. Garvey advanced on Jake. His eyes were glaring. I'm not going to argue with you, Jake. Just give me the computer. And he grabbed it away from Jake's loose hands. Maybe Mr. Garvey had expected Jake to argue further. Maybe he expected to have to wrestle Jake for the possession of the computer, like two kids fighting over a toy. But Jake didn't resist when Mr. Garvey snatched the computer away. But Mr. Garvey used way too much force. It was like lifting something that you think was going to be heavy, but instead is surprisingly light. Mr. Garvey snatched the computer from Jake's hands, only to throw it backward over his head. For a frozen moment, they all watched it fly through the air. Winston's heart stopped as if it had predicted what was going to happen next. The mini computer hit the back of the park bench. There was a sharp cracking sound. The computer then dropped to the seat, teetered there for a moment, and fell to the grass. Mr. Garvey made an inarticulate cry and ran to pick it up. He inspected it for damage and pressed the power button. There was no twiddle-dee-dee-dee. He pressed the button again. Nothing. Mr. Garvey shook the computer lightly, and Winston could hear a rattling sound. Something in there had become disconnected. Their team computer was dead. Oh no, how are they going to handle this? We must be getting close to the end. See you next time.